Huh. My coffee mug was still on the kitchen windowsill, the one with the chipped handle I kept meaning to replace. She never threw it away. I noticed that when I came back for my tools 3 weeks later, the mug was still there, sitting in the exact same spot, like it was waiting for something I wasn't anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I own a small electrical contracting business. Well, I do now. Back then, I was just a licensed electrician with a service van and enough steady clients to keep the lights on. No pun intended. My wife and I had been married 11 years. Her name was Lorraine. She was 58 when all this happened. We met at a neighborhood cookout hosted by a mutual friend, and within the first 20 minutes, I knew she was the kind of woman I'd been waiting to meet for most of my adult life. Smart, direct, didn't say things she didn't mean. I had one son from my first marriage, grown and living in Denver. He called on birthdays and Christmas, and we were fine, cordial, no drama. Lorraine had a daughter from her first marriage, Melissa, 29 years old at the time, worked part-time at a nail salon, lived with a boyfriend in an apartment about 40 minutes away. For the first 8 years, things were good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but solid. We had a 3-bedroom house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'd paid off most of the mortgage. The deed had both our names on it. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The shift happened gradually, the way most bad things do. You don't notice until you look back. Melissa's boyfriend left her in the spring. Just packed his things one Thursday while she was at work and sent her a text. She was devastated. She called Lorraine crying every night for 2 weeks, and I understood that. I genuinely felt for her. Losing someone like that is hard at any age. Lorraine asked if Melissa could stay with us for a month while she got her footing. I said yes. I meant it. Melissa moved into the guest room with 2 suitcases and a box of shoes. She was polite at first, quiet. She'd make herself scarce in the evenings, eat whatever was for dinner, say thank you. A month went by, then 2. Around month 3, things started to feel different. She started leaving her things in the bathroom we shared. The master bath, not the hall bathroom. Lorraine didn't say anything. I mentioned it once, gently, and Lorraine looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. She's going through a hard time, Walter. I let it go, but it kept going. Melissa started using my workbench in the garage to store overflow from her room. Bins of clothes, a broken floor lamp, 3 cardboard boxes that never got opened. I asked Lorraine about it. She said Melissa would move it when she got a bigger place. I said, "When's that going to be?" Lorraine said, "When she's ready." I remember the tone more than the words. It wasn't hostile. It was just closed, like a door that had been quietly shut without me hearing the click. By month 5, Melissa was no longer the guest. I was. That's the only way I can describe it. She'd taken over the living room by 7 in the evening, watching her shows, talking on the phone, having her friends over on weekends. I'd come home from a 12-hour job, dirty and tired, and there'd be 3 women I barely knew sitting on my couch eating takeout. I talked to Lorraine about it. She listened. She nodded. Nothing changed. Then one evening in October, Lorraine came into the bedroom while I was reading and sat on the edge of the bed. Her posture was strange, stiff. She'd clearly been thinking about what she was going to say. She said Melissa needed more stability, that the guest room wasn't giving her enough space to really feel settled, that it was hard for Melissa to heal in a space that felt temporary. I listened. I waited. Then she said, "I think it would help if you moved into the guest room for a while, just until she's back on her feet." I put my book down. I asked her to say it again. She did. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, "Lorraine, this is our bedroom. We slept in that room for 11 years. She said she knew that. She said it was just temporary. I asked what temporary meant. She didn't have a specific answer. She said it depended on Melissa. I asked if she'd considered asking Melissa to look for an apartment instead. She said that wasn't fair given what Melissa had been through. I said, "What about what I've been through? This is my house too." She said, "I know. I just need you to be patient." I moved into the guest room that weekend. I told myself it was temporary. I was 61 years old, sleeping in a twin bed with a cheap mattress, and I told myself it was temporary. I want to tell you I confronted the situation immediately. That I stood up, drew a line, made my position known in a way that couldn't be ignored. I didn't. Not right away. I kept working. I kept coming home. I kept being patient because I loved my wife, and I believed she would come back to herself. I thought the fog would lift, that she'd look around one day and see what was happening clearly. Instead, on a Tuesday night in November, Lorraine sat me down at the kitchen table and told me she thought it would be better for everyone if I found somewhere else to stay. Not permanently, she said. Just for now. Melissa needed the house to feel like home, and having a man around was making her anxious after what she'd been through. I looked at my wife for a long time. Then I said, her anxiety about her failed relationship is the reason I'm leaving my own house? Lorraine said, I knew you wouldn't understand. I said, help me understand. She couldn't, or she wouldn't. I'm still not sure which. What I know is that I went upstairs, packed 2 bags, and walked out to my truck. It was a 2009 Silverado with 200,000 miles on it and a heater that worked on 3 of its 4 settings. I drove to the end of the street and sat there for about 10 minutes with the engine running. Then I drove to a motel off Route 22 and checked in for one night. That one night turned into 6 weeks. The first morning, I woke up at 5 like always. Force of habit. I sat on the edge of the motel bed in the dark and I took stock. I was 61 years old. I had 2 bags. I had my work van. I had a business account and a personal checking account, both at the same bank where Lorraine and I had a joint account. I had tools. I had clients. The first thing I did that morning, before coffee, before anything, was drive to the bank when it opened at 9 and separate every dollar of my money into accounts that had only my name on them. I want to be clear about this too, because people always ask. I did not take the joint account money, only what was mine. My direct deposits, my savings that had been transferred there over the years. I made a list beforehand and I moved only what I could document as mine. Then I called a lawyer, not because I decided anything, because I needed to understand where I stood. The lawyer's name was Howard. He was patient, methodical, and direct in the way I appreciated. He asked me whose name was on the deed. I told him both of ours. He said, then you have rights to that property regardless of who asked you to leave. He told me to document everything, dates, conversations, the fact that I left under pressure rather than by choice. I started writing things down in a small notebook that night. 6 weeks in a motel is a particular kind of loneliness, not the loud kind, the quiet, procedural kind. You learn the vending machine schedule. You learn which housekeeping staff come by early. You eat breakfast at a diner 2 blocks away because the motel coffee is undrinkable, and you need one thing in the morning that feels like a choice you made. Lorraine texted twice in the first week, once to say she hoped I was okay, once to say she hoped I was okay, once to ask if I knew where the circuit breaker map was. I answered the second one. I told her it was taped inside the utility closet door, which is exactly where I'd put it 12 years ago before she moved in. She didn't text after that. I had a foreman named Dennis who'd worked with me for 6 years. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. He didn't say much. He just started scheduling me for more jobs, longer days, which was exactly what I needed. Work has always been the thing that keeps me tethered when everything else is fraying. I was good at my job. I'd always been good at my job. And somewhere around week 3 of the motel, I started thinking clearly for the first time in months. The legal process was slow and not dramatic. There were no courtroom moments. No one shouted. Lorraine hired an attorney. I had Howard. We exchanged documents. There were conversations through intermediaries about the property, about the joint account, about the personal property still in the house. The house was the complicated part, because my name was on that deed and because I had documentation showing I had been asked to leave under circumstances I had not agreed to. Howard said my position was stronger than I probably felt. Lorraine's attorney argued I had vacated voluntarily. Howard produced the text where Lorraine had asked me to leave. He produced the motel receipts. He produced the notebook. The divorce was finalized 14 months after I drove to the end of that street and sat with the engine running. I got a fair settlement. I won't go into the exact numbers, but I walked away with enough to do what I'd been quietly thinking about since week 3 of the motel. I bought a property outside of Mechanicsburg, a little over an acre. There was an older house on it that needed significant work. Electrical, plumbing, the works. I did most of it myself on weekends and evenings. Dennis helped on the heavy stuff. But the real thing was the separate structure on the back of the property, a large outbuilding, maybe 1,600 square feet, with good bones and a concrete floor, Previous owner had used it for storage. I spent the better part of a year turning it into a proper electrical training facility. This wasn't a sudden idea. I'd been teaching evening certification courses at a community college for years, just one night a week, nothing formal. But I'd always thought there was a gap in the market for hands-on, practical training for people who wanted to get into the trade without going through a 4-year program. Apprenticeships were harder to find than they used to be. People were falling through the cracks. I set up workstations, real panels, actual wiring scenarios, everything a person would encounter in the field. I partnered with 2 local contractors who agreed to accept my graduates for apprenticeship consideration. I built a website. I charged a fair rate. The first cohort was 8 students. Within 6 months, I had a waiting list. Within 2 years, I was training more people than I was doing direct contract work. I restructured the business, brought Dennis on as the lead field operator. I focused on the school. I wasn't famous. I wasn't on television. But in the trades community in central Pennsylvania, people knew who I was. My name came up when people talked about practical training programs. I was quoted in a Regional Contractors Association newsletter. I gave a talk at a workforce development conference in Hershey. My name was out there. That's all it took. It was a Thursday afternoon about 2 years and 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I was in the outbuilding running a panel exercise with a new cohort when Dennis came to the door and said I had a call on the office line. I told him to take a message. He said the woman calling had said it was personal. I finished the exercise, washed my hands, and walked into the house. The message on the notepad said, "Lorraine, please call back." I stood at the kitchen counter and looked at that piece of paper for a long time. I didn't call that day. I called 2 days later on a Saturday morning because I wanted to be calm when I did it. I wanted to be the version of myself that had been built in the years since the motel off Route 22, not the man who sat at the end of the street with the engine running. She answered on the second ring. She sounded older, not in a cruel way, just different, like years had moved through her voice. She said she'd seen the article about the training program. She said she'd recognized the town, then the business name, then she'd looked it up online and found my picture. She said she sat with her laptop open for a long time before she called. There was a pause. Then she said, "I wanted you to know that I think about what happened." I said, "Okay." She said Melissa had moved out about 8 months after I left. Found a new boyfriend, got an apartment in Carlisle. The house had been quiet ever since. She said it differently than I expected, not as a complaint, just as a fact. She said, "I think I made a mistake, Walter." I'd imagined this phone call. Not obsessively, but I'd thought about what I would say if it happened. I said, "I think you did too." She asked if there was any chance. She didn't finish the sentence. She let it sit there, unfinished, the way people do when they're not sure they want the answer. I told her I wished her well. I meant it. The bitterness had gone somewhere in those 3 years, burned off like fog by the time it takes to just keep working, keep building, keep getting up before 5 and doing the thing you're good at. But I told her I was in a different place now, literally and otherwise. She said she understood. We talked for maybe 10 more minutes. Small things. How my son in Denver was doing. Whether I still drove the old Silverado. I told her I'd finally replaced it, a 2022, same color. She laughed a small, quiet laugh at that. Then we said goodbye. Not coldly. Just finished. I hung up and stood in my kitchen, the one I'd gutted and rewired and rebuilt myself. And I made a cup of coffee and watched the sun move across the back field for a while. I'm not telling this story to make her the villain or to make myself the hero. Life is more boring than that. I'm telling it because when I was sitting in that motel room at 61 years old with 2 bags in a van and the particular silence of a place that isn't yours, I thought my life had contracted down to its smallest possible shape. It hadn't. It had just cleared out space. Everything I'd built in the years after, the facility, the partnerships, the students who called me to say they'd passed their licensing exam, none of that exists if I stay in a house where I was made to feel like a guest. If you're somewhere right now that's making you feel that way, like a guest in your own life, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm 63. I've learned that people mostly know what they need to do. They just need a minute. But here's what I'll say. The morning I drove to the bank, the morning I called Howard, the morning I stopped waiting for someone else to decide what my life was going to look like, those were the mornings things actually changed. Not the night she asked me to leave. The morning I decided what to do next. The Silverado still has a heater that works on 3 of its 4 settings. Some things you just keep. I've thought a lot about why things went the way they did. Not obsessively. I'm past that, but enough to understand it. Lorraine wasn't a cruel person. I want to say that clearly, because it's true. She loved her daughter. That love was real, but somewhere in that love, she stopped being able to see what it was costing. She stopped asking whether what she was asking of me was reasonable. She just kept asking, and I kept saying yes, and neither of us noticed how far we drifted from anything that looked like a partnership. That's how most quiet damage gets done. Not in one big moment, in 100 small concessions that nobody writes down. When I was sitting in that motel room at 61 with 2 bags and a notebook, I wasn't angry. I was something worse than angry. I was confused. I had done everything I thought a decent man was supposed to do. Worked hard, kept my word, made room when room was needed, and I had ended up with the motel off Route 22 and a heater that worked on 3 settings. What I eventually understood is that decency without discernment isn't a virtue. It's just availability. And people, even people who love you, will fill the space you keep making available to them, right up until there's nothing left. The morning I drove to the bank, the morning I called Howard, the morning I bought that property in Mechanicsburg and stood in that empty outbuilding trying to see what it could be. Those mornings weren't about anger or revenge. They were about clarity, about finally asking myself what I actually knew how to do and deciding to do it without waiting for someone else's permission or timeline. Dennis used to say that a good electrician doesn't fight the current. He works with what's there and routes it somewhere useful. I thought about that a lot in those first 2 years. All the energy I'd been spending waiting for Lorraine to come back to herself, I just rerouted it into the building, into the curriculum, into the students who showed up on Monday mornings not knowing which endable wire stripper to hold and left 8 weeks later ready to work. That's what I'm proudest of when I think back on it. Not that I survived what happened. Lots of people survive hard things. I'm proud that I made something out of it that was worth more than what I lost. When Lorraine called and told me she'd made a mistake, I believed her. I also knew it didn't change anything. Not because I was punishing her, I genuinely wasn't, but because the version of my life that existed by then had been built on the understanding that I wasn't going back to being someone who waited. There's a kind of intelligence that only comes from being put in a corner and having to think your way out. I didn't have a plan when I left. I had tools, a notebook, and a lawyer named Howard. That was enough. Because the real work isn't in the planning. It's in the willingness to get up the next morning and do the next right thing, even when you don't know yet what the thing after that will be. I'm 63 now. The school has a waiting list. Dennis runs the field operations. I wake up before 5 because that's just who I am. Some things you keep. Some things you let go. Knowing the difference? That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it.